There we go. Perfect.
Good stuff. All right, so welcome. This lecture, I've decided to talk about how to debate about the economy. Good economy debates are like they can be your bread and butter, and if they can be your bread and butter, you're going to have a very good time because there are very few debate topics that do not intersect in some way, shape, or form with economic considerations. So if you can make any debate about the economy and you can get really good about debating about the economy, you're going to have a leg up. So the economy, what's the economy? What do we mean when we talk about the economy? That was a question.
Money.
Money.
Okay.
Money.
Yeah. How it relates to society, I guess.
Yeah, the economy is the societal production of goods and services in exchange for currency, which we then use to purchase more goods and services, blah, 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 blah. I mean, it's a measure of productivity at the end of it. So the economy is essentially it consists of all forms of economic output. Inputs and outputs, I should say. So when we talk about debating about the economy, 99% of the time, that means debating whether something is good or bad for the economy and then what the antecedent effects of that are. I think that for the most part, economy debates can really get into the weeds. They can get into very dense economic data, and so trying to filter into them becomes a little bit tricky. But once you really understand what things are being measured in an economy debate, it becomes a little easier to talk about them. So let's talk about different components of the economy, like how to measure them, how to talk about them. Let's start off with actual just overall economic output. What is a measure of overall economic output?
GDP.
GDP. What is GDP?
Gross domestic product.
Gross domestic product. There's also a related measure known as GDP per capita, which takes the gross domestic product of a country. Every country has its own GDP, and you divide it by the number of people in the country, and then that creates a measure of economic productivity controlling for population size, right? So, the United States and China at this point have very similar overall GDPs. However, China has 4 times the population of the United States. So on a per capita basis, China still lags significantly behind the United States. Same for other countries like India that are increasing in terms of overall volume, but on a per capita basis, well behind the United States as well as lots of countries in Europe and Japan and so forth. So GDP is a great overall measure of economic output, and it's a great sort of generic starting point in terms of thinking about how is an economy doing. I think that the fundamental problem with GDP, though, is so broad and so overarching, covers everything, that it becomes very hard to pinpoint, first of all, what's causing GDP to change. Secondarily, it's very difficult to move the needle on GDP because it's so large. A single action, even if it is, devastatingly consequential, like the blockade of the Straits of Hormuz, for example, devastatingly consequential for the GDP of almost every single country on Earth. Still a 1 or 2% drop in the bucket. In the grand scheme of things, it's tiny, right? On a percentage basis. But on a real basis, that still represents, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars of output being wiped out, which has significant consequences. So GDP is, a good place to start in terms of thinking about economic output. But it's not the end all be all. Economies are comprised of sectors. Like different sectors of the economy lend different amounts of value, different amounts of output. What are some different sectors of the economy that you can think of?
Technology.
Great.
Produce? Never mind.
Produce?
Yeah, or like
Agriculture.
goods. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, agriculture, yeah.
Okay.
Like goods and services, like different services people do. Would that be part of it?
Yeah, absolutely. Other big ones include like manufacturing, healthcare,
Pharmaceuticals?
sure, pharmaceuticals. Yeah, a lot of these categories have like subcategories. So like pharmaceuticals are kind of they kind of fall into multiple pieces. They're kind of healthcare, but they're kind of biotechnology, and they're kind of like it can be really difficult to sort of pigeonhole different industries in terms of like what sectors they fall into. Good news is it doesn't really terribly matter for debate purposes how you're classifying something, except if the resolution is being specific about it. But in any event, sectors or industries often form the premise of economic debates. Oftentimes, debates will center on a specific industry, and then therefore, debates involving the economic impact of that industry become possible. For example, every single resolution dealing with artificial intelligence probably intersects in some way, shape, or form with the economic considerations of AI. Because AI has already had dramatic economic consequences and will continue to do so in the near future, right? As a share of our overall economy, the size of AI just keeps increasing. That's not slowing down. So sectors can be an important way to conceptualize economic debates in terms of how a sector is being hurt or how a sector is being helped. Noting, of course, that the larger the sector, the larger the impact. If you want to run an Econ ad based off of the plan hurting the underwater basket weaving industry, you're not going to get a whole lot of traction out of that, right? So oftentimes, econ debates either need to focus on large, important sectors of the economy, or alternatively, rather in terms of thinking about the sort of production side of things, you can think about the investment side of things. What is investment? What does that mean? How does that work? I have money, I want to invest it. What do I do?
So you put money in something? Oh, no, I was going to say, when you put money in something and hoping for a return out of it.
Okay, but how do I do that?
But in the stock market.
Yeah, consumers can own a certain percentage of a company, and because they're putting in on that percentage and like buying that percentage, either they can get like a dividend return, so a certain amount of portion for money, or they invest that money, it grows, they sell the stock.
Yep. Yeah. Lots of different investment vehicles, right? I think the stock market is the most prominent one. Anybody can buy or sell stock. Certainly there's other vehicles for investment. In recent years, private equity, that's a real big thing. Private equity firms, right? They take people's money, they invest it in particular companies, often controlling shares of those companies. They get to sort of affect how the companies do business. Southwest Airlines, great example. A private equity firm came in and scooped up a controlling share, or at least if not a controlling share, a very significant minority share, and they were able to functionally force Southwest Airlines to abandon a lot of its longstanding business practices and bring the airline more in line with the rest of the industry, which, at least in the short term, has increased its profits, right? So there's the investment side of things. There is also the consumer side of things, right? Who are consumers? All of us. Every single person in this room is a consumer. Consumers are people who purchase goods and services using the currency that they have acquired through various means. And so consumers are an important part of the economy because in order for an economy to function, consumers have to buy stuff. If consumers are not buying stuff, the economy is doing very, very poorly. So you have all these different factors. You've got, the production side of things, your sectors, your businesses, in other words. You've got the investment side, you've got the consumer side. So all of these are fair game to introduce for econ debates. And the wonderful thing is that when you're trying to run a disadvantage, you can choose to talk about any of that sort of trio. And oftentimes it's helpful to label a disadvantage, not as a generic economy disad, but as something more specific, like a business or a sector-specific disad, a consumer confidence disadvantage, or an investor confidence disadvantage. It allows you to talk in much more specific details about the levers that make the economy turn. And it does in some form invite more robust discussion of what matters most to an economy. So for the economy to be at its apex, is it more important for consumers to be confident than investors to be confident? Is it more important for businesses to be confident in the direction of their industry than consumers? Or there's so much interrelation of these factors that you really get to discuss these issues in very granular detail. And the more that you do that, the more your opponents are going to be woefully unprepared to have a debate on your terms. The secret to running a successful econ disad is making it very specific, getting away from generic, oh, your plan is bad for the economy, and steering the discussion into your plan tanks consumer confidence by this many percentage points, which leads to this runoff effect, blah, 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 right? The more specific you can get, the worse off your opponent will be. So that's kind of the global level overview. Let's talk a bit more specifically about how to put an econ argument together, either an advantage or a disadvantage. Step number one is the uniqueness debate. So the uniqueness debate, I would argue, is one of the most critical components of an effective econ argument because, one, economies are really hard to grapple with, to grasp, to really, the economy is so large and there's so many different pieces to it that if you ask 5 different economists exactly how well is the economy going to do over the next year, you're going to get 5 different answers. Because there's just so many different leading indicators, trailing indicators, so many different inputs and outputs that trying to really get a sense of how the economy is doing is such a difficult task. So the purpose of the uniqueness debate is to stack the deck in your favor by identifying as many relevant factors as possible that favor your interpretation of the economy. Right now, do you think the economy is doing well?
No.
No.
But the stock market is literally the highest it has ever been, ever. So how can your perception accord with that reality?
Maybe the stock market could be high because of inflation.
Okay, so inflation could be part of the game, right?
But there's mass unemployment. There's been signs of recession levels of unemployment all around the United States. And if employment directly contributes to the economy, then a loss of it then reflects, the economy isn't doing super well, even though our stocks are up.
So here we're seeing sort of the stratification of the economy, right? Some parts of the economy can be doing well, while other parts can be doing very poorly. The uniqueness debate requires you to emphasize the elements of the story that best favor either, if you're affirmative, the need for change, or if you're negative, the need to stick with the status quo. So on the affirmative, if you are running an argument that, let's just say the plan is we need to build more, actually, let's do this. We need to modernize the US power grid. Let's just say that's the affirmative. We need to spend a bunch of money modernizing the US power grid because it's going to be good for the economy. I'm being very broad about that intentionally. From a strategic perspective, in order to maximize the argument that this is good for the economy, what do we need to show in our uniqueness? That the economy is doing poorly or that the economy is doing well right now?
We would need to show that the economy's doing well.
We need to actually show the economy is doing poorly.
Okay.
If we were like
then
making like a,
improve that the improvements would make it do better.
Yeah, because put it this way. If the economy is doing well right now, there's less urgency to make it well because it's already well.
Okay.
Right? But if the economy is doing poorly, people are struggling, then if we do something to make it better, that's a lot more consequential. Like, if we were in the Great Depression, the consequence of actions to improve the economy would matter a lot more compared to, say, actions taken at the height of economic growth in the post-war period. It's just the reality of it, right? So in general, it is advantageous to demonstrate that the economy is not doing so hot. But when we say the economy, we want to be specific, right? We want to think about what is the specific sector or what is the specific element of the economy that we want to focus on. You mentioned unemployment. There's rising levels of income inequality, right? There's a lot of areas where things are not going so well. How do we articulate that? We have to do research. So a big part of any econ debate is doing preparation, doing research to identify factors, indicators that the economy is not doing so hot. I like to call these red flags, right? And it's so easy to just Google, like, what are the red flags? Like, I'm just reading this article from Reuters this morning. Even though GDP is very high, the economy is overstimulated and bond markets are not doing so hot.
quick second. What does it mean when the economy is overstimulated? Such a weird wording. Like, if I go into a debate and I'm like, the status quo says right now, like, the economy is overstimulated. Like,
So
what does that
I was
mean?
wondering that too.
Like, what is
an
that?
economy being overstimulated simply means that there are artificially high levels of spending.
Okay.
Typically spending, it could also be investment, but overstimulation is a cause of inflation. So we're gonna have to take a segue into another part of the economy, which is central banking. every country, or I assume every country, has a central bank. Do you know what the central bank in the United States is called?
The Federal Reserve.
Federal Reserve, that's absolutely right. The Federal Reserve is the central bank and historically has been independent from the rest of the US government.
Which is crazy, by the way.
Come under some pressure in the most recent administration, right? But the purpose of the central bank is to try to influence economic conditions.
Are they the invisible hand?
To,
Are they the invisible hand?
the invisible hand, right? Well, they're I don't know. When we talk about the invisible hand, we mostly mean like the invisible hand of the market.
Yeah.
But they are, yeah, I wouldn't characterize them as the invisible hand. They're more the group of people sitting at a table in the back room making decisions that impact all of us with very little any of us can do about it. They are probably the most important, not their only responsibility, but one of the most important responsibilities is setting interest rates. Interest rates are basically, you know, if you take out a loan, you pay interest on the loan. So an interest rate on the loan is going to depend on a lot of factors. You know, from a personal finance perspective, it's a lot different than Federal Reserve interest rates, which are interest essentially paid on U.S. Treasury bills, which are a way that the government borrows money. There's a lot more complexity there, but long story short, the Federal Reserve can set interest rates and they can move it up or move it down. When the Federal Reserve sets low interest rates, bless you, they do that to try to stimulate the economy. So do you remember in COVID where the entire economy shut down overnight? How do you think the Federal Reserve reacted to that? Did they cut interest rates or did they raise them? They cut them. They cut them to the bone, like literally as low as they could go. They cut them because the economy was completely locked up. Productivity virtually evaporated overnight across huge numbers of sectors, right? There were huge numbers of layoffs. And so the Federal Reserve used one of its tools in its toolkit to try to stimulate more economic activity, which is to cut interest rates. When you make borrowing cheaper, which is what happens when interest rates are low, that stimulates the economy because people are able to buy more stuff. It becomes a better deal. You can take out a cheap mortgage to buy a home or a car, right? And so the idea is that through all these factors, interest rates go lower, you stimulate economic productivity. But then what happened like in 2022-ish?
2022.
In terms of the economy? Like we were recovering from COVID, things were going swimmingly, but
Stagflation.
the I word, inflation went way up because the market got overstimulated, right? Interest rates remained too low for too long. And even though we were kind of already emerging from that COVID lull, the low interest rates were, you know, pushing more and more people into the housing market. So housing prices exploded, the cost of groceries exploded, right? Everything, all consumer prices just went through this stratosphere. And do prices ever come down? No, right? Once prices go up, they tend not to come back down. Quick to fall, quick to rise, slow to fall. So even though the rate of inflation slowed a little bit, you know, overall prices remain very high. And so inflation is very problematic for an economy because when the economy gets overstimulated, prices go up and affordability goes down, and there's all kinds of effects and consequences
And
of that.
affordability leads to poverty, and poverty leads to death.
Yeah. So you see where we're going. So many interlinked factors here. So the Federal Reserve, the central bank, sets interest rates. They can try to prevent the economy from being overstimulated, but it's a fine line, right? Because if you have interest rates too high, that can depress economic activity because people are less likely to borrow. like in the 1980s, for example, when interest rates were extremely high, mortgage interest rates were like double digits percentage points, which is crazy. Like it literally made no sense to get a mortgage on a loan, or get a, yeah, I mean, it was so, it screwed up the housing market because very few people could afford to get in. So even though prices were lower at that time, those high interest rates had the effect of kind of depressing a lot of economic activity. So it's very much a fine line. Central banking is very difficult. That's why it historically has been apolitical, right? You don't want somebody in the Oval Office coming in and saying, we need to drop the interest rates and turbocharge the economy, because once you turbocharge the economy, it goes spinning out of control, inflation, you get problems. So
even though they say that consumer confidence is like very low right now and nobody wants to buy things because of central banking and loans and like interest and everything, then the economy is still considered overstimulated. So both are happening like at the same time. Like,
I don't know about that. I think that let me sort through the logic of that. So consumer confidence is low, in large part due to affordability concerns, right? In large part because of income concerns, like incomes are not keeping up with prices. And in some part because of unemployment. I don't think unemployment is nearly as bad as you made it out to be, but certainly underemployment is a big issue right now. So yeah, all those factors kind of combine to form problems with the consumer side of things. But that's just one segment of consumers, right? There's another segment of consumers, predominantly wealthier ones, who are able to, buy third and fourth homes and invest massive amounts of money in the stock market, creating income inequality, right? So there's lots of dimensions to the economy. And like I said, part of doing your research is just trying to find the stuff that supports your interpretation of the story. One person can say the economy is overstimulated, another person can say it's understimulated, and there's just multiple reasons for why that might be. So my advice, whenever you get into an econ debate, is to find at least 3 or 4 different data points that support your interpretation of the economy. Is the economy doing well, or is it not doing well? And try to find data points that collectively tell a story, right? The way that I just did. Underemployment being an issue, consumer confidence being low, due to high prices, due to stagnant incomes, and find data points. Don't just say that all those things are true, find the statistics and provide those statistics to back it up. Your one advantage in an econ debate is statistical evidence, because chances are your opponent isn't going to have access to corresponding statistics that tell the opposite story, because there's no prep once the round starts. So if they don't know that you're running this specific version of an econ ad, they're already going to be on the back foot. They can shout from the podium, no, consumers are very confident right now, but unless they have like actual hard data to back that up, it's going to be difficult for them to do.
Is it specific to app or neck?
California?
App or neck.
Oh, Afrinic, sorry. It's regardless of what side you're on. You should always have uniqueness that's going to support your side of the story, right? Typically, when you are affirmative, you want to demonstrate the economy not doing well. And typically, when you're negative, you want to demonstrate the economy is doing well. So if you find yourself in prep and you're negative and you're not sure what to prep and you're bored and I'm like, I don't have anything else to do, look up some uniqueness statistics in case you get into an econ debate, right?
Can you repeat that about what is typically neg and typically app?
Yeah, so if you're affirmative, typically, I should specify, we are assuming a policy resolution here. So typically the affirmative wants to propose a plan in order to solve some kind of problem or multiple problems. If the problem is that the economy is not doing well, then they need data that suggests that that is the case. Because the advantage would be structured, uniqueness, the economy is not doing so hot. The link, here's how the plan makes the economy better, and then the impact, here's why economic growth is good. It flips on the negative. The negative wants to argue the status quo is great. Everything is fine and dandy in the status quo. The plan's going to screw everything up. So their story is going to be that the economy is doing great. It's going swimmingly, right? Investors are like maxing out their gains, and businesses are investing, and AI is going to turbocharge productivity, and everything is great, right? They want to sell a world in which the economy is sunflowers and roses and everything is looking up. But then the plan, the big evil bad plan, is going to destroy the economy, and that's bad, right? Two different sides of the same coin. So the uniqueness debate. So yeah, minimum 3 or 4 good data points supporting your side of the equation. Okay, let's talk about the links. Links are like, what is the mechanism by which a policy either supports an economy or disrupts an economy? And it kind of goes back to the 3 things we talked about: consumers, investors, and businesses. So the affirmative job is to show that the plan supports consumers or supports investment or supports businesses. The negative job is to show that the plan disrupts consumers or disrupts businesses or disrupts investors. And of course, it can be more than one of the 3. It could be all 3, although that is kind of rare. But feel free to pick and choose the one area that you think is strongest. Let's kind of spitball how to make that case. So let's say our plan is for the government to invest in the power grid. In what ways would the government investing in the power grid be beneficial for the economy?
If the government invested in the power grid, then we could potentially have more like productive energy sources. Like right now, it's taking a lot of power to power them, meaning that every single consumer's bill is more costly. But if we invested more money into it, then it would take less power, less resources, so every individual consumer's light bill could be less.
Okay. So we're focusing on the consumer side of things here, right?
Yes.
So we're increasing the reliability of the power grid, we're decreasing overall costs, we are making sure that people have more money in their pockets, which they can then spend elsewhere and stimulate the economy elsewhere. Great. What about the other 2 areas?
I guess businesses could like produce more output and make more things for consumers to buy.
Okay, sure.
Or maybe you could say, with like, I don't know, the rise of AI, that updated power grids with more investment and more funding can house stronger technology use and can supply more energy to like data centers, which will then boost our economy and boost what we need it to do.
Sure, that's like a very sector-specific argument that could work, yeah. And then investors love the plan because you increase grid reliability, less chance of blackouts, less chance of catastrophic damage. They're going to be a lot more confident about pumping money into companies. So all these versions definitely work. And then in that case, you can explain, or here's the benefit for the economy, and the impact of that is, could be specific to consumers, could be specific to investment. We'll talk a little bit more in a second about how to develop it fully, but that would be the general scenario. I do want to mention that there's one exception. So when I talked about, when you're aft, you want to show the economy's bad. When you're neg, you want to show the economy's good. There's one exception to that, and that is if you are trying to identify what I call a ticking economic time bomb. Some affirmatives try to solve a ticking economic time bomb. And in that situation, it makes a lot more sense to argue that the economy is doing well now, but if this ticking time bomb explodes, the economy goes down. That's an exception I should mention now because I don't want to forget to do it. And just to give an example, let's say your affirmative says the power grid reliability right now is a ticking time bomb. Our infrastructure is, in some cases, over 100 years old. There are massive blackouts in the state of Texas. It seems like every single winter because the power grid there is so overstressed. And there's even vulnerabilities to cyber attacks where other nations like China or Russia could potentially hack into the power grid and shut it down. The consequences of that would be catastrophic for the economy, right? So there's a ticking time bomb, but if we modernize the power grid, we defuse the bomb, we take it away. And that can actually be an even more compelling form of an economy advantage because it is scenario-based, right? It's not a linear argument the way that some other more conventional advantages might be.
Wait, sorry, you said it's not linear, it's what?
Scenario-based. You identify a scenario, the ticking time bomb, in other words. So yeah, ticking time bombs in the economy tend to deal with things such as physical infrastructure or other industry-specific concerns. They can consist of like overly indebted markets or countries even. They can include things like bubbles. Do you know what a bubble is?
Like the AI bubble?
What is the AI bubble?
From what I've heard, and I'll be honest, I don't know that much, but isn't it when they keep pumping so much money into it, it's gonna get bigger and bigger to the point where it collapses and that all that money basically went into nothing and then you get no return?
Yeah, so bubbles refer to when a particular class of asset becomes wildly overinflated in terms of its value. So the AI bubble, and here's the thing about bubbles, you do not know something is a bubble until it pops. So calling it an AI bubble is a bit of a misnomer because it could very well be genuinely AI companies are worth as much as they are because AI will have that level of transformational impact, right? But it could also be a bubble, but we don't know until it pops. So when you are trying to argue that something is a bubble, you can characterize it as a bubble, but the burden is on you to prove the bubble will eventually pop and to explain why. And that's hard to do, but you have to do it. But yeah, the AI bubble, you may be familiar with the housing bubble of the late 2000s. That was largely responsible for the Great Recession. Home values rose well above and beyond what they were actually worth, in large part because banks and other financial corporations were giving basically free money to anybody who wanted it to buy a home. So the supply of money in the housing market put upward pressure on home values. Eventually, those mortgages came due, and well, turns out giving a $700,000 mortgage to Sally, who makes $15 an hour, is not exactly a great idea, and they can't make their payments, and the bottom fell out of the bubble. So every house everywhere in the country lost enormous amounts of value. And the more the homes were foreclosed on, the larger the supply of homes in the market, but the pool of buyers is very, very small because When you're in a recession, many more people are unemployed, many more people take pay cuts, right? So all these factors coalesce into one primary impact. So bubbles popping can be very, very traumatic for an economy. So if you can say, for an affirmative, there's a bubble, we need to take an action to deflate it, prevent the bubble from popping, that's great. Alternatively, the negative can argue you create a bubble or you inflate a bubble and it's going to pop and that's bad. Another variation of that flavor. Definitely something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so we've talked a lot about uniqueness factors, what plans might do, how you can conceptualize how different policies can affect the economy, and be as creative as you want, by the way. There's so many different ways policies can impact the economy, many of which are just kind of we don't even think about them. So be creative, do research, look for it. But then what happens in terms of describing the impact of the economy? What should we do? Well, there's a couple ways of thinking about it. We can think about it in terms of, I guess the easiest way to think about it is in terms of consumers, individual people. When the economy goes down, people lose their jobs, people's incomes fall, people have a harder time affording basic goods and necessities. And then in that scenario, the impact really becomes very similar to what we talked about in the last lecture. Poverty rates go up. Things like homelessness go up, right? So you can really link it to a wide variety of systematic linear impacts that become worse when the economy goes down. So there's that piece of it. You can also focus on the investment side, right? The investment side being that when investment dissipates, stock prices go down, investors start pulling out their money, they park it in safer places like gold or bonds where it's not being reinvested in the economy as much. That causes all kinds of knockdown effects, right? It filters down to consumers, of course, but it also causes things. Such as businesses close down. You have generally speaking wider ranging impacts on the economy that then come back to bite consumers. Same with closing, business confidence collapsing, businesses shut down, people lose their jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The other thing to think about is economies don't exist, national economies do not exist in a vacuum. The global economy is intertwined, interconnected, right? Stuff that happens in the Strait of Hormuz affects the economy here in the United States, even though we're 8,000 miles away. So with that in mind, when you're describing the impact of a growing economy or a shrinking economy, it is always best to emphasize the global nature of economic impacts. Because when a car company decides to stop production on a vehicle because it's no longer going to pencil out due to a shrinking economy, it's not just, the Germans who are losing out, it's all the individual suppliers in their whole global supply chain. They've got folks in China, they've got folks in, just all over the place making supplies and parts that eventually end up in their cars. And so due to that, any kind of economic collapse is going to eventually filter down and affect all countries. And while developed economies are better equipped to weather periods of economic decline, developing economies are not. If you have seen just in the last week, the migrant crisis in Morocco, where tens of thousands of Moroccans attempted to cross into a Spanish exclave, a city basically that borders Morocco. a lot of that's because of the economy in Morocco. It's just a developing economy. There's not a lot of opportunities, right? So people become desperate. And, that on a wider scale leads to profound impacts in developing countries. So the global nature of the economy means that you can emphasize that it's not just about the US economy, it's about supporting the global economy, supporting globally people's ability to survive, to just scratch out a living. That can be pretty dramatic in terms of its impact. And then I would just cross-apply everything we talked about in the impact lecture in terms of terminalizing impacts. There are some kinds of economic impacts where you can go a step further than just describing linear impacts. For example, you might be able to make the argument that conflict, war, becomes more likely in times of economic distress. People would point to World War II as kind of a classic example, right? The collapse of the German economy led to the rise of the Nazi Party, from which all of the horrors of the Second World War emerged from. So there is an argument to be made, and you can do research on specific scenarios for economic decline causing a war, where you can access these sort of higher magnitude impacts. So that is the economy. So overall, my advice with the economy, if you're getting to an economy debate, is come prepared with uniqueness arguments. Try to focus on a specific dimension of the economy and focus the debates on that dimension so that you are not giving your opponent as much room to work with. Set the terms of the econ debate, tell a persuasive link story, and be able to articulate the widespread impacts the economy has for people. Any questions?
Can you go over uniqueness again?
What uniqueness is?
Yeah.
Uniqueness refers in essence to the status quo, the way things are right now. More precisely, uniqueness is an argument that either leaving things the way they are is good, or leaving things the way they are is bad. And that if nothing is done, the direction of where things are going is either good or bad, depending on what you're trying to accomplish. And the reason uniqueness is so important is because it establishes the urgency, the need, right? Kind of goes back to what I said earlier. If the economy is doing super well right now, there's less urgency to make it more well, to make it better. But if the economy is doing very poorly, if it's struggling, then there's a lot more urgency, there's a lot more impact to improving the economy. So that's why it's really important. If you get into a debate and your opponent argues, well, the economy is doing really badly, but you're able to show the economy is actually doing really well, then you remove a lot of the urgency, you remove a lot of the significance of their advantage. Yes.
And then how do you so you're talking about a lot of these factors affecting like this one car company affects like this other thing, and then it scales globally. How is that not like a mix of snowballing and the butterfly effect?
I mean, the butterfly effect is like actions having unknowable consequences. This is the case of actions having very much time-tested and knowable consequences. It's just the reality of the interconnectedness of the economy. Actions in one place will always have consequences elsewhere, right? So the idea is that these are knowable consequences. You simply have to articulate them.
So it's not snowballing because this is actually a thing that.
I mean, you can characterize it as snowballing.
but it's okay to use here.
Yeah, I mean, snowballing is a fine term to use. I think the term that you might be thinking of is like a slippery slope.
A slippery slope.
Yeah, slippery slope is different because the slippery slope is like where there's a much more tenuous chain of events, but I don't think this is what you were describing is a slippery slope. It's just
So slippery slope gets confused with what you're trying to do right now.
sometimes. A lot of debaters will throw out the term, oh, that's a slippery slope, whenever you talked about any kind of like impact with a high magnitude but low probability, like a nuclear war, for example. And they say that it's a fallacy, but then they don't do the work to explain why the scenario won't happen. So I tend not to like the slippery slope argument. I much prefer to just hear the explanation for why it won't happen. Any other questions?